primarily focus on here in the U.S. is regulatory compliance, quality systems. We do a lot of regulatory stations, 510Ks, warning letter responses, 483 responses. Avoiding those type of things is one of the things we're going to be focusing on the rest of this week. Let's see, I've been in regulated industry forever, since the late 70s actually. A lot of it in pharma manufacturing, sterile device, sterile injectables, class 2 drugs, radiopharmaceuticals, that's a joy. Medical device, also clinical research. So I've seen regulated industry from a lot of different perspectives. What we're going to spend today on is primarily the European quality standard. Now, recently this was just updated, and when they updated it here in 2016, it now looks a whole lot more like the U.S. requirements, and we'll be contrasting the two as we go through this. So it's 9. We'll probably go for an hour and a half or so, take a mid-morning break, let everybody catch up with their email, bathroom breaks, coffee, what have you. Take a break around lunchtime. Work the same pattern this afternoon. Take a mid-afternoon break, and then wrap up later this afternoon. This course is a whole lot more fun and a whole lot more interesting for you when you participate. So, lots of good, I'd like to have lots of good discussions, questions, as they come up. We have lots of time. We're not time constrained. You don't have to go rushing through this. It is a full day today. And what we're focused on today is the regulation. What we'll work on the next 2 days, Wednesday, Thursday, is auditing to this and other regulations. Some of this information will be repetitive a little bit. It won't be entirely duplication, but because you will be auditing, those of you that will be here for the auditing course, you'll be auditing to this, so we'll cover some of these same topics, but we'll cover them in a little greater depth. Everybody hear me okay? All right, cool. As I said, the more you participate, the more interesting this is. So let's go ahead and get started.
Just as an FYI, we just signed with Emergo.
Oh, you did?
To do our Australian and New Zealand
Registrations.
For registrations.
Okay, cool. Yeah, Emergo does a lot of authorized rep business. Emergo was just purchased by UL, so they are working their way through that integration. UL also functions as a notified body. That is a separate, notified bodies basically have oversight over what we do. So they've built a very strong firewall between those two operations. So if you have UL as a notified body, you cannot work with Emergo and vice versa. Just to keep the conflict of interest, or the appearance of a conflict of interest under control. All right, so let's go ahead and start to walk through this. This is not my computer, so it will be fun learning those. Mine died on me Tuesday. On the road, of course. All right, regulatory compliance. Is it an option? Not if you want to stay in business. We'll talk more about the differences among these, but there are two primary regulatory schemes. There's the U.S. and the rest of the world. The U.S. runs under the Quality System Regulation, QSR, 21 CFR. CFR stands for Code of Federal Regulations, if you have not seen it before. The European standard and much of the rest of the world follows the ISO Quality Management Standard. As you'll see as we go through this, the overlap between these two standards, especially now with the 2016 version, is extensive. Where there are differences, and we'll focus on these as we touch on them, they tend to be country-specific requirements. For example, ISO has almost nothing to say about the content of your labeling. The US has a lot to say about it. That's in a separate section of the CFR, 21 CFR 801. So most of ISO is foundational, and it covers virtually any product you might make. You could have one product, you could have 100 products. It really doesn't matter from the ISO perspective. The ISO is a quality management system, and it's foundational to all medical device. The title is Quality Management for Medical Device. It is primarily focused at manufacturers, but not exclusively so. This same standard is used across the board. You could only, and we have a number of these, they don't manufacture. Good example, software. Software is regulated as a medical device. There's no hardware manufacturing there. They're not putting things together. It's all software coding. Yet the same standard applies. One of the more interesting things, and we'll touch more on this in the auditing segment, is there are a lot of applications to this standard that are outside of manufacturing. Well, not so much outside of manufacturing, but for components of the process. So you as the product owner, folks who write the 510K if it's required, PMA, whatever may be required, are absolutely, if you market outside the US, absolutely compliant with this. How about your suppliers? We'll focus on this a lot in the auditing course. They don't own the product. Are they subject to this? Yes, they are. But only those pieces of it that apply to them. And we'll touch on this a lot. So the one thing I want you to appreciate at this point is that this is a blanket that covers the whole industry. Now, it does not cover pharma. Pharma has its own set of regulations. Generally stiffer than medical device, but not in every case. Medical devices, we'll see here in a bit, was written in the US a lot later than pharma. Pharma goes back to the early 1900s, 1901, 1902, Pure Food Act, Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which is still the law. Device didn't come on the scene until 1976, very late in the program. So device looks a lot different than pharma, contains a lot of things that pharma does not. For example, management review. We'll talk more about that when we hit that section. No such requirement for pharma. You would think that pharma having higher standards, being more stringent, would in every case be more specific than device. Not true. All right, so that being said, 13485 is the ISO standard for medical device. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ISO standards. A lot of them are technical standards. 60601, electrical safety. There's 19993, biocompatibility. Is that right? I think so. There's hundreds of these things. This is the one that is a broad brush quality management system standard. So how do these things operate? ISO operates, as I said, outside the US. Canada adheres to it. Most other countries either have formally adopted it or follow it informally. A lot of the developing world, a lot of Asia, a lot of Mideast, don't have a fully formed system, yet they follow CE mark, which we'll talk more about, and ISO 13485. The US, because they like to be contrary, doesn't. They follow their own deal. If you talk to the FDA will opine that the QSR is more stringent. I disagree. The QSR, because it is federal law enforcement, is reactive. Where FDA will come in, and we'll talk about their substantial enforcement powers, where that happens is if you fail to follow some regulation. So either do something you're specifically prohibited from doing, or don't do something that you're supposed to be doing, and we'll talk about lots and lots of examples. If either of those two situations occur, FDA will and does come in and hit you over the head. ISO works differently. ISO is proactive. ISO wants to avoid the problem in the first place. The FDA, because its enforcement of a federal law does not work that way. You don't see the police stopping you to warn you not to speed on 360. If you do and you get caught, unfortunately I didn't today, they react. They react to your failure to follow the law. ISO works differently. They try to prevent the problem in the first place. And we'll see a lot of those differences as we walk through these two standards. Very first system I built, this was probably 20 years ago now, first time I sat before an ISO standard, the ISO auditor actually wrote me a non-conformance for not having a procedure, a written procedure that said how often I would go on the internet and go see if the Europeans might have changed something. I looked at him like he was insane. You can't cite me for that. Oh, yes, they can. It's a very proactive system. They want to avoid problems rather than deal with them after the fact, which is the US model. All right, so how do these work? We'll touch more upon that later. I think I'll wait till we get to there. Quality system conformance. ISO 13485, it says semi-voluntary. That's true to a point. It is semi-voluntary only so much as you want to stay on the market. ISO 13485 compliance and certification for most products, touch more upon that in a minute, is a prerequisite to being able to legally market in the EU and other places where it's recognized. So if you lose your ISO cert, it is a big deal. You can no longer legally market. Now, notified body is not going to come in and shake the door shut, arrest people. They don't have that authority. FDA does. We'll talk more about that. But this is a very important certification once you get it to make sure that you keep it because it's a prerequisite to being able to legally market. I have had a client called us in a panic. Notified body had come in to conduct his, for some reason they hadn't been in years. They're supposed to do this annually. I'm not sure how it slipped through the cracks. But he had written it, or he had a consultant write him his ISO 13485 quality system, like 2008. Everything was still version 1. It was still sitting up on the shelf where it had been put in 2008 and had not been touched. I still read notified body yanked his cert, and he's all upset. How can they do this? I'm not responsible to keep this updated. Oh, yes, you are. So this is a living, breathing system. It's not static. Once you have it, you're not done. You'll see lots of areas that we'll touch on where you routinely are back in this thing, looking to see what changes might be necessary. All right, so this way. Here we go. Let's talk a bit about 9001. Everybody familiar with 9001?
No.
9001 is basic quality management. You're not a problem.
I'm newbie.
You're
So,
new?
yeah.
9001 is basic quality management. You can get certified to 9001 if you run a tire repair shop. You can be 9001 and virtually do anything. It's very basic quality management. Things like fact-based decision-making, management involvement. These same themes are found in 13485. They basically derive from 9001. The important thing for you all to recognize is 9001 is not adequate. You cannot market a medical device legally with a 9001 cert only. 9001 is foundational, covers virtually everything and anything. It's not sufficient by itself for medical device. Now, many companies elect to have both 9001 and 13485. Why? Why would they do that? Because a lot of their customers, not being on the more sophisticated end of the medical device spectrum, don't recognize 1345, have no idea what it is, but they have heard about 9001. So as a customer issue for recognition from their customers, they maintain their 9001 cert. You can decide whether you want to do that or not.
We dropped that several years ago.
Yeah.
It was just additional cost, basically.
There's additional cost, you have to make sure that the notified body auditor is qualified to audit against both. There's a significant cost to maintaining 9001. The downside, like I said, is it's not sufficient by itself. You can piggyback it with 1345, but you can't operate with 9001 by itself. There are other things that we need to be attentive to, and we'll talk about several of them. The medical device and in vitro diagnostic directives. The one that you need to pay attention to is medical device directive. You'll hear me refer to that as the MDD. That also is changing. This is brand new. That is transitioning to the medical device regulation, the MDR. The transition period for that is between now and 2020. The differences between the MDD and the MDR, despite the fact that I think they tripled the length of the document, are not all that extensive, but it does give the European governments more authority, more power to enforce them. And there are some differences, but for our purposes, they're not critical. I just want you to be aware that basically that's how you get a CE mark. You want to market most products, actually all medical device products. If you want to market in Europe, you need a CE mark. The MDD is the pathway to get that. We'll touch on it. We're not going to dig into it in great detail. So, Federal Quality, FDA Quality System Regulations, QSR, that's 21 CFR, Code of Federal Regulations. Those are online. You can look them up. They're easily available in the 800 series, starting at 800, going through as high into the 890, 900s. Touch on a lot of different aspects. The one that you want to pay most attention to is 820. 21 CFR 820, where the majority of good manufacturing practices are described. There are others that are also applicable. 801, for example, talks about labeling. 803 gives you some guideline on how to actually get on the market in the US. 805, 807, 812, 814. It isn't only 820, but that's where the bulk of it lives. And if you can't sleep at night, you can fire that up on the internet and read through it. It's not as bad as reading the FD&C Act, which is really obscure, but it's not fascinating reading. Our good friends to the north, the Canadians, have their own scheme. It's called, right now it's called CAMDICAS, which is ISO 13485 with a couple of additions, and it's relatively straightforward and simple. You guys have Canadian registration. A 1345/CAMDICAS system is basically the same as your bread and butter 13485, but has a few extra procedures on how do we do a recall in Canada, for example. How do I notify Health Canada if we have some kind of issue? There are similar procedures for the EU, very similar procedures. The Canadians want their own. It's relatively straightforward. CAMDICAS is also changing. That is transitioning to, actually the US led this program called MedSAP. MedSAP is a combined audit process, which makes a whole lot of sense. And the Canadians right now are the only people that are actually enforcing it, where you have a common audit rather than multiple individual audits. Right now, today, unless you are part of the MedSAP process, you market in the US, you market in Canada, you market in Europe, you're subject to at least 3 different audits. The FDA is supposed to visit you, class 2. FDA
Class 2 exempt, yeah.
Yeah. The FDA is supposed to visit you every 2 years. That doesn't happen, but that's their target. ISO is going to audit you every year. Canadians, and the Canadian audit is actually outsourced to the ISO folks too. So you have all these different audits going on. MedSAP is a means to put all of those audits into one audit. So you have a MedSap auditor. The audit process is significantly different. It will probably double the time it takes to do one of these, and the reports go everywhere. There are 5 countries that participate in MedSap. US, let's see if I can remember them all. US, Brazil, Canada, the EU is a observer, and Japan.
And Australia.
And Australia, thanks. The reports go to all 5, whether or not you mark it there. Now, when they conduct these audits, they're only holding you accountable for the requirements of the countries you're in. Japan, for example, has a boatload of specific requirements. I'm not going to audit you against those unless you also market in Japan. If you do, then all ordinance was at 165 and all that are going to apply. But for your purpose, just realize these things are out there. We don't need to spend time on the details and all the specifics, but what I'm trying to draw for you is a picture of the regulatory scheme worldwide and how you fit into it.
We will be working towards getting MSAP in the next
notified
year.
bodies right now, I just spent a couple of days with a BSI auditor. They are struggling. They're trying to get their arms around it. We're working on how our audit's going to look different if we do them under MedSap. It is one of the big differences, just as an aside, is the MedSap audit is a quantitative audit. It's a scored audit. Up to this point, your notified body audits have looked at nonconformances and classified them either minor or major. Now there's a scoring scheme that they're going to use to get a numerical grade. That's going to change things a lot. But we don't want to dig into that, trust me. 9,000, the 9,000 standard, as I said, these are fundamental. There's thousands of them, literally. 9001 we already touched on. The one that we will spend a fair amount of time on the rest of the week is 19011, which is the ISO standard on how to conduct an audit of any quality management system. So you'll hear that one again. All right, so we're going to look at some of these principles. These are 9001 quality management principles, but they are embedded in 13485 also. They're not itemized per se, but these are almost philosophy, and they are also incorporated into 13485. Customer focus. There's specific regulations in 1345 on this topic. How do we interface with our customer? And this is one of the interesting differences between 1345 and the FDA. The FDA has almost nothing to say on this topic. Now, if you, well, that actually gets into complaints, we'll touch on that later. ISO spends a fair amount of time proactively wanting to know, how do you manage the customer interface? How do you determine what the customer wants to buy? For most businesses, that's not difficult because we only make prescribed things. You no doubt make a number of different products and perhaps in different configurations, but do you custom manufacture for a given customer, or do they pick off the menu? Either way it works, but ISO spends a lot of time focused on that interface between you and the customer. It's one of the key differences between ISO and the US. They really don't spend hardly any time on it. Leadership. In 1345, in Chapter 5, there are a number of specific requirements to assure that leadership stays involved. Key concept. It's fundamental to 9001, it's fundamental to 13485. It is a requirement. If you don't have procedures that are in alignment with the standard, you will get a nonconformance. From the FDA side, this is also fundamental, although not specifically spelled out to the degree that it is in ISO. Management review is common to both, But who holds ultimate responsibility for the operation of the business? Who does the FDA target? Management. Who's legally responsible for management? Who goes to jail?
Management.
I vote aye.
Sorry, Mike.
FDA.
All in favor?
There you go.
Listed.
Spend just a little bit of time on this. The FDA, because they are federal law enforcement, have very broad enforcement power. A lot of people underestimate what they can do to you. There's a whole range of things that they can do to you, and they are not constrained to necessarily following any specific order. So let's take a typical example. FDA walks into the plant, they're going to conduct a routine inspection. FDA does inspections, notified body folks do audits. FDA aren't inspectors, notified body folks are auditors. Not a huge deal, but it's something to keep in mind. FDA walks in the plant, conducts their inspection. FDA inspections the routine ones are usually announced. They give you a couple weeks. There's a reason for that. From their perspective, they want to make sure that the people they need to speak with are there. If they walk in unannounced, which they can legally do, and you're on vacation, if you're quality and you're on vacation, then they kind of wasted their time. So for a routine inspection, they'll give you a couple of weeks notice. We're going to be, here in your plant on the 22nd. Panic time. FDA inspections are open-ended. You have a start date, but you'll never see them, at least in my experience, you'll never see them give you an end date. They're here as long as they feel like being here. I have seen them go over a year. What do you think happens to the business when the FDA's in the plant for a year? It's not good. FDA in the plant is hugely disruptive. So one of our goals is, we're walking through regulatory compliance here, one of our goals is to make sure that we are compliant, it's a legal requirement, and that our system is well-written and transparent and can be easily comprehended by both the FDA and notified body auditor. Our objective is to get them out of our hair as quickly as humanly possible. We don't want them here for a month or longer. We want them to come in, see what they need to see, check the boxes they need to check, and go away. So that's what our objective is, help you make sure that your system will accomplish that. But, so FDA walks in the plant and they find issues. You have issues. So, as they conclude the inspection, they will give you what's called the FDA 483. The FDA 483 is their form number. It is the list of your many sins. You failed to comply with this aspect of, and there's a specific way they write these things. You should say you failed to comply with 21 CFR 820.65 in that bullet. So they will give you that before they leave. So here's your list of non-compliance. They will take their copy of it, go back to their home office, meet with their management, and make a determination on how serious is this. Now, at the same time, you're scurrying around going, what do we do about this? I need to respond to the FDA with an action plan of how we're going to fix all the things that they came up with. So there's a lot of activity going on both sides. FDA will look at what they found and make a determination, how serious do we believe this is? They're looking at this from the perspective of health and safety of the user. So things that they determine might have a negative impact on user safety are looked at pretty seriously. If they believe that there's a problem, they will generally issue you what's called a warning letter. Warning letters are public, they're on the internet, you can look them up. Warning letters are a very big deal. You have to interact now with the agency in a specific time frame. If you sell to the US government and have a warning letter that in many cases will put a stop to those sales. Not good. If you import stuff from outside the US, frequently warning letter will cause a custom hold. You can't get stuff in or out. Not good. So warning letter by itself is a major problem, and it goes downhill rapidly from there. If you either fail to respond appropriately or the things that FDA found are particularly egregious, they can also hit you with what's called a consent decree. They go to court, they get a federal judge, and you don't know anything about this necessarily until the judge's order hits the mailbox and say, you're basically out of business unless you hire a consultant that we recognize to basically replace your quality management system. I've seen this happen twice. In fact, I used to work for the consulting company that does this. Hugely expensive. We had these guys in the plant. This was in pharma. We had them in the plant for over a year. There were 5 or 6 of them, $500 an hour. You can imagine how these costs roll up. Really bad. They can also assess civil fines. Some of these fines, our good friends, they're just west of here. Abbott Diagnostic holds I think they still hold the record at something like $2.5 million. So these fines can be significant also. They just whack. You don't have a whole lot of opportunities to fight this stuff. They'll hit you with the fine, and you can go to court and try to get it changed, but you're fighting an uphill battle. This is a situation, both ISO and FDA, where you're basically guilty until you prove yourself innocent. So, get your notification, you're fine. Now, this is all on the civil side. It can get a lot worse, but for it to get a lot worse, it requires an intentional act. The civil side is used for serious non-compliance. Things that are deliberate can also send you over on the criminal side.
One of our major competitors just got off a consent decree after 5 years.
5 years.
Fighting it.
Yep. Yeah, you're on, glad you mentioned that. You're on consent decree until the FDA decides you should be off.
They spent lots and lots
Yeah.
and lots of money and time, shut down the whole plant.
Yep, I believe it. Yeah, they can come in, and I've actually seen this happen. They can come in and chain the door shut without going to court. Now, you can fight in the court after the fact, but you're fighting an uphill battle. They can bring the federal marshal in and shut the place down. They have very, very broad power, and this is all on the civil side. Serious misbehavior, particularly intentional behavior, fraud, can cross over onto the criminal side. FDA has what's called CID, Criminal Investigation Division. If, forbid, you ever see an FDA agent walk in the door who is wearing a sidearm, call your lawyer. That's not an inspector, that's CID. Big problems. Most of the inspectors carry, but they carry concealed for their own safety. CID looks like a federal marshal. In fact, a lot of times they come in with a federal marshal. That is a criminal investigation. They have reason to believe that you're committing fraud, deliberate action. Everybody goes, oh, I'm going to jail. No, you're not. Unless you do things like falsify data. Hey, this device actually failed its finished device inspection. It's worth a whole bunch of money. I want to ship it anyway. I'll change the data. I'll say it passes. Out it goes. Somebody gets injured. FDA finds out about it. They come in. They find that falsification. Somebody's going to jail.
Point blank period.
Know what these are? They have them. You can do the perp walk. I'm not going to put these on because I didn't bring the key. I did that one time. It's so fun. So you don't want this. They have the legal authority to arrest you and take you away. But fear not. This doesn't happen for failing to sign and date a document. This happens because you're deliberately committing fraud. Make sense? So now that I've scared everybody.
They're also not limited to just U.S. proper, right?
Now
They can,
that gets difficult. because now you got extradition treaties and stuff like that. FDA's jurisdiction is not limited to the U.S. Their enforcement of things outside the U.S. gets more difficult. But if you, regardless of where it happens, if you manufacture devices that are marketed in the U.S., be it Thailand, China, anywhere else, FDA can and does routinely inspect. And yes, they can shut you down. Now, the criminal prosecution is more difficult. But yeah, they come in, if they can't physically shut you down if you're in China, they'll absolutely put an import hold. You'll never get anything through customs. So yeah, it's a great question. Make sense? So far, so good? Okay, customer focus. Because again, this is more of a focus from the ISO perspective, but this is understanding what your customers want. If you have product that is customized for the customer, you want to make sure that you've got very good process in place to capture exactly what is it they want, so that you can provide it for them. A lot of businesses, we make 3 things and it's, version A, version B, version C, and that's it. That's pretty simple. But when you customize devices for a given customer, this needs to be a more robust process. Understanding the customer's future expectations. How do you do that? Just good communication, trade shows, things like that. There's not a lot of requirement around that. So meeting in the ISO 9001 approach, exceeding our customers' expectations. Should also recognize this as just good business. Makes sense. Leadership we touched on. Establish purpose. The big hitters in ISO are appropriate staffing so that you have enough people to do the job, and leadership, senior management is actively involved. From the FDA perspective, it's also a very good idea. Actually been a couple of court cases on this. Having a big problem, FDA coming in and doing all kinds of unpleasant things to you, going to court as the CEO and saying, I didn't know we were doing that. There's no defense. It's actually been tried. It doesn't work. So as senior management, senior leadership, you are required to know what's going on. All right. Organizations rely on people, obviously. This is almost a cliche. Making sure that people are properly trained is a big focus in ISO. Also on the FDA side, develop, use your abilities, make sure that we're actually utilizing our people appropriately. Training is where you see a lot of that in ISO. It's in Chapter 6. Process approach. Virtually, and we'll see this one in auditing that we'll touch on tomorrow. Virtually everything you do can be looked at as a process. Everything has inputs. There's a process, and then there are resulting outputs. That is a very good way, and you'll see how we make use of that in auditing. That's a very good way to think about what you do. What are my inputs? Customer order, specifications, bills of material. There's lots of inputs. What's the process? The actual assembly of the device, output, ship it. So where we think of our operation in those terms, we usually tend to be more effective, more efficient. We show how these processes are interrelated. In your quality manual, if you're following ISO, there's a requirement to show how your various processes are interrelated. We do it with a attachment that's a graph that shows how one thing impinges on another. But regardless of how you do it, it isn't actually an ISO requirement to have these interactions described somehow. Improvement. If you understand nothing from our discussion today, understand that this is not a static process. This is not once and done. There's a couple of areas that we'll talk about, particularly risk management, that's been even more emphasized in the 2016 version of the ISO standard. You'll see good manufacturing practice, which is the U.S. acronym, usually referred to as current good manufacturing practice. I have several clients, and I actually thought this way very early in my career, till I found out differently. It is virtually impossible to take the CFR and from only what they have written, create a quality management system that's compliant and that will not get you written up by the FDA. On the face of it, that doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? They're going to hold us responsible for this. It seems like the least they can do is tell me what my specific requirements are. Not so much. There are a lot of things that are expectations, requirements. We will be cited if you don't do that. I'll give you a couple of examples that are not explicitly described in either the FDA, the QSR, or ISO. Management review is a great example. Management review is, we'll touch on later, is a formal meeting where a number of prescribed topics must be addressed. It's a requirement. It's a requirement on the FDA side. It's a requirement that you do it on the ISO side as well. How often are you required to do it? What's it say in the standard? How frequently must you do this? It doesn't say at all. So if you write up procedures as, oh, we're going to do management review every 5 years, I guarantee you, you will get a FDA 483 for that, and you will get an ISO 1345, probably major non-conformance. It doesn't say. You're right, it doesn't say. Your responsibility is to know what current good practice is. How do you do that? It's difficult. One way you do that is by going out and auditing other people, keeping up with what's online. There's lots of ways to keep current with what the state of the art is. And there are several places in the regulation that will catch you. Internal auditing is another one. How often does the standard say you must conduct an internal audit? It doesn't. Now, the benchmark for an internal audit of some, and we'll talk more about this Wednesday, Thursday, is annually. Doesn't mean you have to do everything annually, but you should be taking a look at your own system on at least an annual basis. Fail to do that, you'll probably end up with a non-conformance. So, it is not at all a static system, and it is not explicitly defined for you. Many things are, but there are a few that are not. It's your responsibility as manufacturers, ISO 13485 certified quality management system, compliant with FDA QSR. To know what these requirements are, they change over time. That's why they call it current good manufacturing practice. It is an uphill slope. I can't think of a single example where requirements get easier. Anything come to your mind? Not that in 30 years, I can't think of one single thing, with the possible exception of maybe electronic data, that has ever gotten significantly easier. It's always increasing quality.
Quick question, from
Yes.
your perspective, what would you recommend? Would that be annually in regards to management review and then
Absolutely, no less than annual.
and then for the internal audit every 6 months or annually?
It's up to you. There's a jump a little bit ahead of ourselves. In the 2016 update to the standard, they changed the approach to the audit. It used to be just de facto, if you were doing it annually, they're happy. That's still the expectation, but now they want you to consider in a documented fashion the risks that may be inherent in these various processes. In other words, should I be auditing some things more frequently than annually? If I'm having particular issues out in manufacturing in one area, let's just say labeling, for example. We've caught a bunch of mislabeled product, hopefully not. We know we have an issue here, so it would be appropriate to take a close look at that more often than annually. That is one of the changes in focus that's in the 2016 standard. And from a risk-based perspective, as we talk about the 2016 standard, you'll hear the word risk 8,044 times. It's everywhere. From a risk perspective, one size fits all once a year is not considered adequate. They really want you to look at what your situation is, and should I be looking at certain aspects more frequently? It's up to you to determine what that frequency is, but I'll tell you, anything less frequent than annually is going to get looked at. Great question.
We break ours up, just so everybody knows, we break ours up into quarterly.
Okay.
We accomplish the standard throughout the year, we do quarterly audits,
Good.
look at different sections every quarter, and then we can come back and focus in those quarters on area. We need to look at how we start measuring risk, but we can look at areas where we've had issues and revisit those in addition to covering that section of the standard.
And we'll talk a lot more about that in the audit portion, but that schedule is also audited.
Yeah.
You need to keep
Yes, it is.
keep up with it. Okay, let's see. Evidence-based decision-making, this is just good business. We base our decisions on facts. That's why in the latter part of the standard, it talks a fair amount about data acquisition, tracking, trending, reporting this to senior management. The FDA also talks about this, 21 CFR 82250. Talks about statistical analysis of tracking and trending data, making sure that you're reporting this information to senior management in a way that helps them make decisions. For example, let's say out of manufacturing you had 35 failures last year. So you report to senior management, last year we had 35 failures. Is that helpful? Out of how many products? 35 failures by itself doesn't tell me anything. If you made 36 products and had 35 failures, that's not so good. If you made 35,000 products and had 35 failures, that's way better. So this raw data needs to be put in perspective. This is actually in the QSR and also in ISO. It's a requirement that you massage this data to make it meaningful. Make sense? Okay. So factual decisions on data. Here's talk more about this also in auditing. How do I get down to the facts? There's lots of different ways that we'll look at root cause analysis. There's some other ways. But make sure that our decisions are based on facts, not on somebody's pet theory. Which happens a lot. Relationship management. This has gotten hugely important, particularly on the ISO side. They are all over your relationship, particularly with your critical suppliers. For a lot of businesses, that is contract manufacturing. Also, critical component suppliers. The ISO auditors are now required to conduct unannounced audits at these places. They're struggling with it, but they're starting to happen. The last couple of years, they've actually, particularly the high-risk devices, but now it's trickling down. If you have any contract manufacturers, we'll talk more about this, but make sure that your contracts with them and your quality, if you have quality agreements, which you must have anyway under 2016, make sure that those don't preclude. I've seen contracts that say, no one can come audit us on your behalf. I saw a contract from a major company up in Canada that said no one can come audit our contract manufacturer, including the FDA. Really? Good luck with that one. But the contract says you can't do this. Wrong. Something to pay attention to, because many of the older contractors have had that type of language. That won't fly. The old days, and this goes back a long way, the old days of making decisions on who my supplier is based solely on price are long gone. This is a mutually beneficial relationship. And you, as the product owner, are it's particularly in the 2016 version of the standard, are held accountable for actively managing this. Say, yeah, they do it, just go do it, we don't care, not gonna fly. ISO Water is gonna dig in on this, we'll spend a lot more time on this, we start looking at chapter 7. All right, 13485, 2016, I think we already talked about this. This is a full quality management system. It addresses everything that you need, and you tailor this to your specific situation. For example, do you have design? In your case, I'm sure you do. So many places don't, they outsource that. Now it's still, just because they outsource it doesn't mean they ignore it, but they're still responsible for it. They're just not conducting it day to day. Evidence of conformance, you'll hear me talk about this a lot Wednesday, Thursday. Objective evidence of compliance. So tattoo that across your forehead. As I mentioned earlier, this is an area where basically you are guilty until you provide me with evidence that you're not. If you cannot provide me with aforementioned evidence, you're going to get a non-compliance. So let me see the documentation from your last management review. Oh, we did it, but the person that's supposed to take notes was on vacation and we didn't get any minutes. Non-conformance, management review not conducted, or actually the way I would write that is no documentation of management review, major non-compliance. You did it, so you told me, but you can't produce a document, non-compliance. It's all, the old FDA cliche for eons has been, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So it's all about what you can demonstrate. Objective evidence of compliance is your best friend. So as we go through this system, talking a lot about opportunities to create and maintain that objective evidence of compliance. So when the FDA inspector asks for you, here you go. Excellent. Check the box and move on. 1345, as I mentioned, 2016 is specific to medical device. It is ISO 9001 on steroids. It also applies to the degree for the things that they're doing to suppliers, contract manufacturers, various other contractors such as contract sterilization, basically anything that touches the medical device process falls under 13485. And yeah, they are audited against it, but as I mentioned, only for the elements that they do. Contract manufacturing would not be a good example. Let's say that you buy certain components that are critical to your device. And you have described the supplier of those components as critical, which means ISO folks are probably going to go visit them. So what are they going to audit them against? They don't make a medical device. Do they fall under 13485? They're not a medical device manufacturer. They make motors or PLCs or control boards or something like that. That's not legally a medical device. Are they subject to 13485? This is kind of the short answer is yes, because what else does the notified body, what other tool do they have? They only have a hammer, therefore everything is a nail. So if they are inspecting a critical component manufacturer, even though they don't manufacture a medical device, they are going to hold them to 13485 2016. Now, let's say they manufacture a PLC. The inspectors are on site. Are they going to look at their management review minutes? No. It's not under the scope of what they do. Are they going to look at complaints? Possibly, but it would be complaints from you, not complaints from the end user. They never see those. They're not going to look at vigilance. They're not going to look at a lot of things. They're going to focus in on the manufacturing process itself, under using the 1345 requirements in that section. Make sense? Just A lot of people struggle with this. Well, how can they audit them to 1345, they're not a medical device? Because it's the only tool they have. Okay,
So just a quick question on that. So when we have, let's talk criticality of a component, we have UL listed device,
right,
and they're providing a UL listed component,
right,
and they have to carry UL certification and quarterly audits, et cetera.
right.
Is that suffice for what they're looking at with that? Because again, we're holding them to make sure that they provide us continue the UL certification of a critical component going into our device that's certified overall.
Right? So you have this supplier listed as a critical manufacturer. Because you have listed them that way, the odds of your notified body going to visit them are really good at some point. Now, if they are being routinely audited by somebody else, some other notified body, might even be the same notified body, that might abbreviate that process. So that really is a case-by-case deal.
Okay.
Particularly if it's the same notified body. They're certified, a lot of component manufacturers are getting themselves certified to ISO for the things that, is applicable to them. So if they're certified, you're certified by the same notified body, they're probably not going to go visit them. They already are seeing them routinely. So it's really a case-by-case situation. Really important in your quality manual is for all of the topics that 13485 covers, which is virtually everything, what is not applicable to us? And in the 2016 version of the standard, they enlarged what you can exclude. And it's really important that you pay attention to this. You don't make any sterile, do you? I wouldn't think so. You absolutely want to exclude the requirements for sterile process, the requirement for validation of said processes, and all the requirements for sterile product themselves. Heck, there's tons of them. Doesn't apply to you. You want to specifically say that in the quality manual, is this section of ISO 1345 does not apply to us because we don't make any sterile product. You need to state the exclusion and the rationale for it. This probably does apply to you, but we'll just use it as an example. Service. We sell our products, they're disposable. Sterile bandages, be a good example. We don't you don't send it back to us, and we don't fix them and send it back to you. Service does not apply to me. Therefore, I'm going to exclude all of the sections under ISO that talk about that. So, and the place to do that is in your quality manual. That's important. That gives the ISO auditor a roadmap to what he's or she is going to focus on or not bother with. So, as I mentioned, in the new version of ISO, you are now allowed to exclude more things. So pay a lot of attention to that. It's to your benefit to exclude things that you can legitimately exclude. But remember that as you write that up in the quality manual, you need a justification. You just can't say, assembly doesn't apply to us. Yeah, it does. So for those things that you can legitimately exclude, make sure that you do exclude them and make sure you include a rationale for why you may exclude them. In your case, sterile product, we don't sell any sterile product. Good enough. There's a nuance in here. I don't pay a whole lot of attention to it, and I haven't seen it defined. For some reason, in the new standard, they made a distinction between exclusions, which can be design control, which you guys would not exclude, and non-applicability. Why they made this distinction escapes me. Two sides of the same coin. I wouldn't spend a great deal of time worrying about it. As I mentioned, what you really want to focus on is, are there topics in the ISO standard that I don't have to worry about? All right, moving on. So as I look at my system, what do I need to do? I need to tailor this quality management system to my business, our experience, how we do this. What processes do we have? What level of people do we have? It's important. What are our objectives? Talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Type of product services that we provided, again, to make sure that we've scoped our system appropriately. Every one of these systems is tailor-made to your specific business. The requirements are fairly uniform, but the application of them is customized. Size and structure of the organization, speaking of which, make sure you have an organization chart. You can put that anywhere you want. A lot of people put it in the quality manual. If you do that, I would consider how often does it change? Because if you embed it in the quality manual and you need to change it, now you have to read the quality manual, which is problematic. And especially if you put names in it, I would suggest you don't do that with positions. They change less frequently. People come and go, positions don't change as much. Make that a standalone, but that is a controlled document. That's the first thing FDA will ask for, and ISO folks will absolutely want to see it. Make sure that you know what your regulatory requirements are. You want those listed. It's critically important. 13485, 2016, the MDD, perhaps other requirements from other markets, the QSR for the US, Health Canada, right now the CMDR. So you want to have very carefully defined what the regulatory scope of your business is, not by product, but by everything you make, all the medical devices. All right. If you look at the standard, we won't spend much time on this. If you see the word shall, that's a must do. Should is recommendation. May is like a recommendation. The only one they really need to pay much attention to is shall. It means thou shalt do it. This is fairly self-evident. I don't think we need to spend any time on it. Process, product, customer satisfaction. I think all of us just inherently know what this stuff means. It doesn't carry any special definition. There is a definition section in ISO, also one in the QSR, but most of them are pretty self-explanatory. This, under 13485, and this has changed a bit, active implantables and implantables have now been condensed into just implantables. Active implantables are things like powered pacemakers, powered defibrillators, things like that. Active medical device, anything that uses a power source is an active medical device. As you work through the MDD, trying to figure out how do I get my product on the market in the EU and my CE mark, these distinctions are important. Advisory notices is the European version of our medical device report. Something bad happened, somebody got hurt, we have to notify the government. Customer complaint, I think we all know what that is. Implantable, self-evident, anything that's embedded in the body. Labeling. It might appear to be self-evident, not always. How about your website? Is that legally considered labeling? You betcha, but not everything on it. There's lots of stuff that you can change on that website without jumping through hoops. There are some things that you should not change or better not change without going through the formal change control process, particularly indications for use, product claims, those things that you have negotiated with the FDA and the Europeans. Say, this is our product, this is what it does. People get themselves in trouble all the time by marketing. Any marketing folks here? Good. Marketing is very fond of trying to come up with new language, latest, greatest, improved, and much of that is okay until they start touching on the indications for use and the actual use of the product. Works for your hangnail and cures cancer. FDA actually monitors these things, and where they find this, you will get what's called a cease and desist letter in the mail, which means that somebody has screwed up somewhere. So be careful about that. Your website is considered legally labeling, but there's a lot of things you can do. Change the colors, knock yourself out. Change the model numbers within some restrictions, you can do stuff like that. There's a lot of things that you can do. Just be very careful with the product specific information.
What about the new explosion in social media?
Good question. Same rules apply. It's not considered labeling though,
Okay.
unless the company promotes it, puts it out. That could be, and probably would be considered labeling. What other people say about your product, you have no control over.
Yeah, no, I
Your
mean,
salespeople, however, you are held responsible for that.
you're seeing more and more companies post information about their products on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, things like that.
Yeah, if you are posting claims about what your product does, what you're legally allowed to market for on Facebook, same rules apply. You go, say, this patient lift will, lift 20,000 pounds. That's not what you have cleared, then if FDA should find it, then they will take action. Great question. Sterile medicals we don't have to worry about. There's tons and tons and tons of requirements there. A couple of the terms that we'll touch on. Authorized representative. This is a business that is in country that represents you in that country or in the EU. Some of those are amalgamated. The FDA has the same process. If you are a foreign business doing business in the U.S., you have an agent. So if the FDA has a problem, they don't try to reach you in Australia, they call me. And then I call you in Australia. Exact same concept. Authorized rep is the interface between you, the company, and the market outside the U.S. I think half of Emergo's business is serving as authorized representatives all over the place. Clinical evaluation. This is another big time change. Some years ago, the Europeans changed this, and it's still different than the US, in that all products require a clinical evaluation, including the Class 1s, which is news to a lot of Class 1 medical device manufacturers, because they just kind of assumed it didn't apply to them, and it absolutely does. You have two choices. This is Europe. We'll talk about the US in a minute. You have two choices. You must provide a clinical evaluation of your product. You can do that with a prospective clinical study. Lots of time, lots of money, very expensive. Has its own set of very strict rules that you must follow. I'll tell you a story about that later. Or, for many products, your other alternative is a literature review. And there is a prescribed way that must be done. It's called MDEV 212-4. That is a requirement. You must do it, one or the other. U.S. does not work that way, at least not today. The clinical evaluation is only required when the FDA says it is. For Class 2 products, that's fairly rare. I've seen several. We've done 510Ks for several that involve chemicals. But that's frequently a case where the FDA, these are old products that have been on the market for quite some time, but the FDA historically has zero clinical data for effectiveness. And you win the lottery, you submit the next one, and they go, we want clinical data from you, which means now you got to spend a lot of money doing this. It's not a request. I've seen that happen a couple of times. But it's always required in the U.S., in Europe, only required in the U.S. if FDA says it is. And that's not after the fact. That is during the 510K process to get the product on the market. They're not going to walk in and inspect you and say, oh, by the way, we want a clinical. That's when you get the product on the market for the first time. Distributors, importers, we all understand what those are. Life cycle.
Hang on a second.
Sure.
Two questions. Number one, stick to one. Authorized representative, that's not the same as an authorized agent?
Similar concept, different terminology.
Okay,
Authorized rep,
Authorized agent is also a representative inside your own company that has the authorization to sign, not just someone outside of your company that you hire. Or am I misunderstanding what 13485 is?
1345 is the quality management system for any product. Authorized reps are representing your company for specific products in specific countries.
Okay, so an authorized agent is not part of that.
Authorized agent is going to be something different.
Okay.
So
Authorized rep sits in France, for example.
Okay, yeah, okay. I just wanted to make sure I was clear with that because it's not addressing an agent as well.
So UK, we sell stuff to the UK. UK is listed on our labeling as
Sure.
an authorized representative. So our
Okay.
facility in the UK.
And then the clinical evaluation, Mike and I have currently been dealing with a supplier that wants to do business with us, but their terminology is class 1 does not need to be FDA certified. And we've
That's a
said,
different,
no, go away, we don't want to talk to you.
that's a
FDA
different
listed.
question.
Yeah, FDA, they sell a class 1 medical device by the definition, I think it's 880 blah, 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 but
Right.
they don't think they need to be listed, which they do. So
They do.
that was the conversation.
Yeah. I was gonna touch on this later, we'll touch on it now. The US has 3 categories: class 1, the lowest risk; class 2, moderate risk; class 3, high risk. So where's your product? You look it up on the through the FDA's website, usually by the product code. For most products, that will tell you what the risk classification is. Obviously, the higher up that classification you go, the more stringent the requirements. Class 3 products require what's called post-market approval. It's the medical device equivalent of a new drug application. Very big deal, $1 million project to get it done, huge amount of information. Class 2 product, medium risk, 510K, which is still a lot of time. We write a lot of.
We're
still a
class
lot
1,
of work
class 2 exempt. So all our products are exempt
for 510K.
for 510K.
Good. Class 1's low risk. Now, to further complicate that, as you just mentioned, there are products that are noted as Class 1 exempt. Now, they're already exempt from 510K. Class 1 exempt means they're also exempt from GMP. That's fairly rare and has to be specifically listed by the FDA. There are a very small number of Class 2 GMP exempts, but I'm not aware of any off the top of my head, but there are a couple. Europe operates a different scheme. They have Class 1, low risk. They have 2, but it's split into 2A and 2B. 2A are the low risk. You're probably 2A. I would imagine in Europe, you're 1, even better. Perfect. And you do see differences like this. Class 2 in the US, Class 1 in Europe. I've got clients that are Class 2 in the US and aren't even considered a device in Europe, and vice versa. So this is market dependent, and you have to know what you are in these various markets. Very good question. So yeah, it's possible to be exempt, but Class 1 products, unless you are specifically exempt, are not exempt from GMP, are not exempt in Europe, are not exempt from clinical evaluation.
So if there's that discussion between the two of you that, hey, I can sell you because I'm not going to FDA register, well, but we're not going to buy. Where's the arbitration board on that?
They're non-compliant with the Food and Drug folks.
Okay.
As a medical device manufacturer, regardless of class, you must register and list.
All right, well, I just bowed over to Mike and I said, whatever you say goes, and we're done.
Yeah, if they're not registered, they're in violation.
Okay. Thank you.
You're different classes of risk in different regions, US versus, for example, Europe.
And Canada.
If whatever reason that product crosses the border, does that increase the risk
Yes,
for that organization?
yes.
Okay.
So let's say a good question. Let's say, for example, you manufacture a device that is Class 1 in the US, Class 2A in Europe. So you sell that to, you know, some customer here in the US, they take it into Europe. And if you don't have the marketing authorization, they're gonna first come back to you. You have a defense. You didn't sell to Europe. This other guy's bootlegging it into Europe. So, you know, you're not gonna take the hit, but they are gonna come, because your name's on the device, they'll come back and visit you first and say, our records show that we sold this to XYZ Distributing, and we don't know what they did with it from that point, so they'll go visit them. Good question. All right, excellent. Life cycle, important one. Life cycle is, this is a lot of emphasis in the new version of 1345. Life cycle is the total life of the product from design to obsolescence. There are documentation requirements for how long that you need to keep, particularly manufacturing documents. Many of them, they just increased from 5 to 10 years in Europe, but many of these are key to the life cycle of the product. So you need to know what that is. Now, for products like yours and many others, particularly the solid state electronics, what's the life cycle? There's no expiration date. So what is my defined life cycle? Have you defined a life cycle for your lifts?
We have, but we've had calls on products that were made in 1961,
Sure. Still in use.
still in use.
So it is an interesting exercise for products like yours, you know, this is hardware. What's the life cycle? It's stainless steel. It's not going anywhere. One of the last CE marks that I worked on was a solid state piece of electronics. So life cycle on that, there's no expiration date. Yet the notified body that was giving us the CE mark demanded that we give them some period of time. Pick one out of a hat. So what we went back to the various component manufacturers and got the mean time between failure data for the major components and used the smallest of those, which is still like 8 or 9 years, and said, okay, that is the lifetime of our product, and it is based on something real. We just didn't make it up. I expect to see more and more and more of that for products that don't have a real expiration. Products like
We define in our verification testing,
Right.
what we test to for a life cycle standpoint, so
Right.
we can default to that.
Yep,
If
that
we have
would make
evidence to
sense.
show that we tested that life cycle.
Yeah, this life cycle determination needs to be something real. You cannot pull this number out of a hat. Post-market surveillance. This is a requirement, both sides. It's a US requirement, it's an ISO requirement. This is what's happening in the real world. And I'm going to touch on this more when we talk about risk. It's a formal process. You should have a procedure on it. It is a look at what's going on wherever I market both my product and products like mine. So what's actually going on? Formal report on file will be reviewed by your notified body inspector. Is only required for FDA in some cases, but it's across the board requirement for ISO. Risk. As I mentioned, the new version of 1345, the word risk appears literally hundreds of times. It's everywhere. It's been part of medical device for a long time. It's gotten a lot more emphasis. You should have a very strong risk management procedure. We'll talk more about that when we get into chapter 7. All right, we're going to have a few minutes here. Take a break back into get through some of the basic stuff. Now we're going to segue into chapter by chapter. A question that I get all the time when I build these quality management systems, I do a lot of, why does my system start with chapter 4? What happened to 1, 2, and 3? Well, in the ISO standard, 1, 2, and 3 are things like applicability to various countries in the EU, definitions. The real requirements start in chapter 4. We build our quality management systems using the ISO organization because it makes a whole lot more sense. It's linear versus the FDA's QSR, I think somebody assigned topics using a shotgun, moving the stuff all over the place. Doesn't follow any logical pattern. ISO does. ISO starts with documentation, goes to management review, goes into general equipment requirements, specific manufacturing, and then post-manufacturing activities like complaint handling, CAPA, things like that. There's actually a logical progression on the ISO side, which does not exist at all on the QSR side. Your system, you can organize it any way you want, as long as you know what's where. All right, in chapter 4, now this is foundational. There's a couple of really important processes and procedures here. But in here, we identify the scope of our work, what do we do, what don't we do, that sequence of interaction, that's typically quality manual. Ensure effective operation control, language right in the standard. How do you do that? We follow our procedures. Availability of resources. It's actually a chapter 6 topic of training, but in chapter 4, we also talk about the requirement to make sure it's done. Monitor, measure, analyze processes. What data do we collect? What's important to us? You don't collect data just for the sheer joy of collecting data. You collect data that's meaningful, that you can take action on. And then implement actions. And as I said, it's all about the documentation. You can do all this stuff, and you don't document it, like you didn't do anything, shouldn't even bother. Already touched on this. What is the role of our organization? This is important, and a lot of people don't do a very good job of this. Are you the manufacturer of record? Now, the regulations use the word manufacturer generally to mean the product owner. So, you're the manufacturer, even if you don't physically manufacture, the way the standards use this term. You have a product, the easiest way is for a 510K product, who owns 510K? Who markets this thing? Who's reaping the rewards from selling this thing? That's the manufacturer. Who has the responsibility for most of these requirements? The manufacturer. You can outsource all kinds of different activities. Does that absolve you of the responsibility? Other folks may do the activity, you are still responsible for it. We'll talk a lot more about that when we get into chapter 7. Contract manufacturers. Contract manufacturers have a defined role. They make product for us. They make product under our direction. We're required to have oversight over them, and yes, in the U.S., they need to register. Authorized rep, we already touched on. This is your person who's representing you in various foreign countries. Importers, distributors, these are all contracted activities that you may have. For example, if you're in Canada, you have a Canadian distributor. If you're in a lot of other countries, a lot of countries require this, you'll have an in-country distributor. These are people performing activities on your behalf that you have a contractual relationship with. Apply a risk-based approach to virtually all of these processes. All of this is looked at from a risk approach. Risk to whom? There's no one answer to that. First answer is to the end user. When we're looking at risk, the very first question is what are the inherent risks to the user? In your case, you brought up a good example. There's a lot of others. That's not the only person. There's the associated people that might be using that, the caregivers in your case. I mentioned that I worked briefly in radiopharmaceuticals. We made a radioactive oncology drug that was a beta emitter, which is a bad actor, not as bad as the gamma emitters, but it was still a bad actor. And the risk to the patient was extreme, but these were late-stage multiple myeloma patients. So they were going to die without treatment anyway. So the risk to the patient was one consideration. what ended up killing this product and the company was not the risk to the patient, it was the risk to the staff. Because this thing was so hot, was so difficult to handle, that the risk to the nurses and the physicians and the people administering this drug was unacceptable. And had they continued with it, it was only a matter of time before they had a spill in a hospital. Spilling a radioactive in a hospital is a very big deal. Not good. The stuff was so radioactive that the patient, they couldn't even use the toilet. They couldn't flush urine down to the toilet because it was radioactive. So what killed this product and the company was not the risk to the user, it was the risk to the other people associated with that. So risk needs to be looked at holistically. First consideration, risk to the person using my product. Second considerations, risk to those people associated with that. Third consideration, risk to the company. Particularly when we're talking about supplier risk, which we'll get to. If I'm single sourced, I've got a component that's critical, I can't make my product without it. It's only made in one place, and that is in some unstable part of the world. That's an unacceptable risk from the company's perspective. Next time they have a violent overthrow of the government, I could be out of business. So we look at risk from multiple perspectives. Let's see. Last bullet. This is really important. Under the 2016 standard, any and all software that functions underneath the quality management system umbrella must be validated. Now, let me back up one step. It's a nuance that came up last week when I was sitting in on a 1345 audit. Needs to be evaluated from a risk perspective to see what validation may be required. That is the correct way to look at this. So, what kind of software might we be talking about? How about your inventory control system? Does that fall under the QMS umbrella? Sure does. A lot of people have these legacy systems that they've been using forever. They're from 1978. They've never been validated. Probably can't be validated. So this is a relatively new requirement, something that you all ought to be thinking about. I would start with what software do we have? But we're looking at the whole quality management system, which means from initial design through product out the door. Inventory control, which frequently does a lot of other things like accounting, which is not on the table, finance not on the table, but it's also my order taking process, my delivery process is on the table. So I would start by making a list of what software packages do we have, and do we have validation for them. Now, for packages that you purchase, you're not going to be able to validate them. Manufacturer should have them validated. So there's lots of people contacting their software providers saying, by the way, I need a validation certificate for this package you sold me 5 years ago. And running into major problems. For anything that you may have written, does that have any application for you guys? So just a caveat, if you write it, you have to validate it. But ISO auditor is going to ask about this guarantee. So when they do, say, yeah, here are the 5 things we use, and here are the validation certificates that go along with them. There are a lot of people having to switch systems because what they've been using for 20 years cannot be validated. All right, it's a good time for break. It's 10:30. 15 minutes, give enough time. And we shall. All right.